Hi everyone, glad to see you back on the channel. Today we're talking about a moment that could redefine global power politics. The signs coming out of Tehran suggest a regime under extreme pressure, possibly facing the most serious internal crisis in decades. At the same time, the ripple effects of this collapse reach far beyond Iran's borders. They point directly toward Moscow and raise a critical question many analysts are now asking openly. If Tehran falls, is Vladimir Putin's fall inevitable as well? To understand why these two stories are now deeply connected, we need to step back and look at how fragile authoritarian systems really are. On the surface, they often appear strong. They control the media, suppress dissent, and project confidence through military parades and aggressive rhetoric. But beneath that surface, these systems depend on a delicate balance of fear, loyalty, money, and legitimacy. When one pillar cracks, the entire structure can begin to wobble. In Iran, that wobble has been growing more visible by the month. Years of economic mismanagement, international sanctions, corruption, and social repression have drained public patience. Inflation has eaten away at savings. Youth unemployment remains painfully high. Basic goods are increasingly expensive, while elites tied to the regime continue to live comfortably. This gap between rulers and ruled has created a deep reservoir of anger that no amount of propaganda can fully contain. What makes the current situation different from past unrest is the scale and persistence of dissatisfaction. Protests are no longer isolated events. They are recurring, widespread, and often leaderless, making them harder to crush. Women, students, workers, and even some traditionally conservative communities have taken part. The slogans have shifted from specific grievances to direct challenges to the system itself. That shift matters because it signals a loss of legitimacy, not just frustration with policy. The Iranian regime has historically relied on a mix of repression and patronage to survive. Security forces were paid and empowered to keep order. Loyal networks benefited from state resources. But this model only works when there is enough money to go around. Sanctions and economic decline have severely limited that ability. When the state struggles to pay salaries or maintain subsidies, loyalty begins to weaken, even among those tasked with enforcing control. At the same time, information control has become far more difficult. Despite censorship, social media and encrypted messaging allow images and stories to spread rapidly. Each crackdown is recorded. Each arrest becomes a rallying point. The regime can still shut down the internet temporarily, but doing so damages the economy further and fuels more anger. It's a vicious cycle with no easy exit. Now, consider Iran's role on the global stage. Tehran is not isolated in its struggle. It is a key member of an informal bloc of authoritarian states that have supported one another politically, economically, and militarily. Russia sits at the center of that bloc. The partnership between Tehran and Moscow has grown significantly in recent years, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Iran has provided drones, technology, and political backing. In return, Russia has offered diplomatic protection and military cooperation. This relationship is not just strategic, it is symbolic. Both regimes frame themselves as resisting Western pressure and defending a multipolar world. They present their survival as proof that authoritarian governance can withstand sanctions, protests, and international criticism. If one of them visibly collapses, that narrative takes a massive hit. A collapse in Tehran would send a powerful message across the authoritarian world. It would show that even a heavily repressive state, with decades of experience suppressing dissent, can be overwhelmed by sustained internal pressure. That message would not be lost on Russian citizens, Russian elites, or Russian security forces. Russia, like Iran, faces its own deep structural problems. The war in Ukraine has drained resources, caused heavy casualties, and isolated the country economically. Sanctions have reduced access to technology and capital. Inflation and labor shortages are affecting daily life. While the Kremlin insists everything is under control, cracks are becoming harder to hide. Public dissent in Russia is more muted than in Iran, largely due to harsher immediate repression. But silence should not be confused with support. Many Russians are disengaged, cynical, and exhausted. The state relies heavily on propaganda to maintain a sense of inevitability around Putin's rule. The idea that there is no alternative is central to his power. This is where Tehran's potential collapse becomes so dangerous for Moscow. If an allied regime, long portrayed as resilient and defiant, suddenly falls apart, it undermines the myth of inevitability. People begin to imagine change not as a fantasy, but as a real possibility. History shows that once that mental barrier is broken, events can accelerate very quickly. Elite dynamics also matter. In both Iran and Russia, the ruling system depends on the cooperation of powerful insiders. Oligarchs, military leaders, intelligence officials, and regional bosses all have a stake in the system. They tolerate repression and corruption as long as it serves their interests and appears stable. When instability grows, loyalty becomes conditional. If Tehran collapses, Russian elites will ask uncomfortable questions. Could the same happen here? Is Putin still capable of protecting the system and their wealth? Or is he becoming a liability? These questions don't need to be asked publicly to be dangerous. Quiet conversations, shifting alliances, and hedging behavior can be enough to weaken a regime from within. There is also the economic dimension. Iran's collapse would disrupt energy markets, regional trade, and military supply chains. Russia has benefited from alternative trade routes and partnerships that bypass Western sanctions. If one of those partners becomes unstable or hostile, Russia's economic isolation deepens. That increases pressure on the Russian budget and limits its ability to sustain long-term conflict. Psychology plays a crucial role here. Authoritarian leaders often project absolute confidence, but they are acutely sensitive to perceptions of weakness. Putin has spent years presenting himself as the guarantor of stability after the chaos of the 1990s. Any event that challenges that image is a direct threat to his authority. The fall of Tehran's regime would be framed by Russian state media as a Western plot, of course. But even the best propaganda cannot fully erase reality. Russians would see images, hear rumors, and draw their own conclusions. The question would linger, if they fell, why not us? It's also important to note that authoritarian regimes often fall not because of one dramatic event, but because of accumulated stress. Each crisis weakens institutions slightly. Each concession reveals vulnerability. Each crackdown breeds more resentment. Eventually, the system reaches a tipping point where it can no longer respond effectively. In Iran, that tipping point may be approaching faster than many expected. The regime faces generational change, with a young population that feels disconnected from revolutionary ideology. Cultural repression clashes with modern realities. Economic hardship leaves little room for compromise. When fear stops working, rulers have very few tools left. Russia faces a similar generational challenge. Younger Russians have grown up in a connected world. Many are skeptical of official narratives, even if they don't openly resist. The war has accelerated emigration, draining talent and ambition. Those who remain are often those with fewer options, which can fuel frustration rather than loyalty. Internationally, the collapse of Tehran would reshape alliances. Countries that have cautiously balanced between the West, Russia, and Iran would reassess their positions. Some would move closer to Western institutions, seeking stability and investment. Others would distance themselves from Moscow, seeing it as a declining power. That isolation would feed back into Russia's domestic situation. A shrinking circle of allies means fewer economic opportunities and more dependence on internal repression. History suggests that states become more brittle, not stronger, under those conditions. There is also the military angle. Iran has been an important supplier of certain weapons and technologies to Russia. Disruption in that supply chain would force Russia to rely more heavily on its own strained defense industry. That could limit its ability to sustain operations and maintain deterrence. At the same time, a collapse in Tehran would embolden opposition movements elsewhere. It would show that patience and persistence can pay off, even against entrenched power. This demonstration effect is something authoritarian leaders fear deeply because it spreads faster than any military threat. Putin understands this risk. That is why Russia has consistently supported authoritarian allies, regardless of ideology. It's not about friendship, it's about survival. Each fallen regime increases the pressure on those that remain. Yet support has limits. Russia's ability to prop up allies is constrained by its own economic and military challenges. If Tehran's collapse is driven primarily by internal forces, Moscow may be powerless to stop it. Watching an ally fall without being able to intervene would be a stark reminder of Russia's declining influence. At that point, inevitability becomes a dangerous word. For years, Putin has benefited from the perception that his rule is permanent. Elections are controlled, opposition is marginalized, the system appears locked in place, but history teaches us that no system truly is. When inevitability cracks, events can move quickly. Elite defections, mass protests, and sudden policy shifts can cascade. The end often feels sudden, even if the causes have been building for years. This doesn't mean Putin's fall would happen overnight after Tehran collapses. Authoritarian systems can limp on longer than expected, but it would mark a turning point. The strategic environment would worsen. The psychological foundation of the regime would weaken. The costs of maintaining control would rise. The Kremlin would likely respond with increased repression, tighter controls, and louder propaganda. But these are signs of fear, not strength. Each new restriction signals to the public that the state feels threatened. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians would continue to face economic pressure, international isolation, and the human cost of war. Over time, the gap between official narratives and lived reality would grow harder to ignore. In that sense, Tehran's collapse would not cause Putin's fall directly. Instead, it would remove one of the supports holding up the broader authoritarian order. It would show that resistance is possible and that power is not eternal. The world is watching a fragile moment unfold. What happens in Iran may determine not only the future of the Middle East, but the fate of one of the most powerful authoritarian leaders of our time. History often turns on such interconnected events, where the fall of one domino makes the rest far more unstable. As pressure builds in Tehran, the shockwaves are already being felt in Moscow. The question is no longer whether these systems are vulnerable, but how long they can continue to pretend otherwise. And if Tehran truly collapses, the idea of Putin's inevitability may collapse right along with it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel.